Right, here we go. So welcome everyone to our little webinar today on, it's really relating to ESG, as you hopefully came to the right room, and entitled Moving from Narrative to Action with Advanced Technology. So I am delighted to be joined today by our esteemed clients from BitterRisk. And for those of you who don't know who BitterRisk are, BitterRisk is part of Core Financial, which is a leading provider of risk analytics tools to the private wealth industry. And they're centered in London, but have a fair bit of business both in Europe and in the US. And joining from Bitter are David Veal and Daryl Roxburgh. And Daryl is specifically going to be talking today. It's really running through a case study that we helped Bitter to deliver, which is around their ESG application. So Daryl's going to do a nice little section on what the problems were, how we went about solving them together, and hopefully address as many questions as we can in time. I'm also joined by Stephen Ford, who is a senior delivery manager at Digitaire, and Stephen ran the Digitaire team working with Daryl's team to get this product to market. Thankfully, we've had some great feedback since, which I'm sure Daryl can enlighten you on. Before I kick off, a little bit of etiquette. I would be so grateful if you turn your cameras on, but probably muted just in case you want to sneeze or slurp from your coffee along the way. But if you can turn your cameras on, it really helps because we can see your reactions. You see us, we see you, and it just makes it very personable. It's not a massive gathering. We don't have quite 1,000 people on it, so do feel free to stick your cameras on, wave if you want to. And if you've got questions along the way, stick them in the chat and I'll see them and pick them up. And we'll try and address those in the time available. In terms of the agenda, having done the intro, the bit I'm just going to cover off is around some of the data challenges, that we're seeing, but also the market's seeing. So I'll just feed back some research on data challenges and specifically ESG related challenges, and a little bit about what we see in the market from the point of view of how organizations are trying to and struggle with addressing broader data requirements, data management requirements, and ESG is one aspect of that. So we would urge you to look at ESG as being part of that overall data architecture, not just something that's off on the sidelines. And I'll talk a little bit about that, and then Daryl will dive into his bit, which is really, frankly, the interesting part of it, and I'll stop talking. And then we've got some time for technical related attributes. I know some of you here are not technical people, but some are. So Stephen Ford will touch on some of the technical aspects of the project, and then we'll do a Q&A. So do stick your questions in the chat as we go. Hopefully things will be clear. If not, shout, let us know, and then we'll summarize with some key takeaways. Onwards and upwards. James, could I have the next slide, please? Oops, sorry, there we go. So the first bit of research I think is worth sharing is this BlackRock survey. So across 420 different investors, investor organizations, which is about a tidy 25 trillion of AUM, they highlighted poor quality and the non-availability of ESG data and analytics as being the single biggest obstacle to sustainable investing. And fair enough, it's across EMEA, APAC, and Americas. The figure is roughly 53% of people originated that this was their top issue. And then second to that is the poor quality of sustainability investment reporting, which is arguably the stuff coming into their analytics. So it's what the underlying portfolio companies, their investing companies, are failing to report on. But those two, and they're linked, as Daryl will talk about later on, seem to be the biggest problems for people in the sector trying to make sense of the ESG world. So it's really around the sustainability part of it. So I think that's worth kind of highlighting. And there was another piece of research which is worth touching on, which is from ProCensus, and they surveyed a smaller number, so about 50 to 70 institutional investors, and their AUM was still a tidy 15 trillion. Their number was that 70% of investors believe that ESG will gain much more weight in the investment strategies going forward in 2021 and beyond. And we're seeing that particularly in Europe, a bit less so in the US, but they also reported that the biggest challenges were data related. So specifically around poor data disclosure by companies, as we said before, but inconsistent scoring and ratings by those third-party providers. And that's one of the problems that Daryl and the team had identified and worked on to solve that in this application, and a lack of quantification of ESG considerations when it comes down to kind of financial modeling, portfolio modeling. So again, we'll try and address some of that today. And also there's the fact there's such a variance in ESG implementation across the different stakeholders in the group, from the investors and client preferences, between the different E, S, and G themes in particular, and we'll touch upon that. But it's what is ESG to you is almost the question, and it differs by individual stakeholder type or investor type. And the top 3 ESG by investors, ESG themes were, perhaps not surprisingly, for 2021, climate change and carbon footprint, 1, diversity inclusion, 2, and then supply chain resiliency. And that's probably become a bigger issue since the pandemic than it was before when this was originally done. The traditional asset managers seem to be doing a better job of this than compared to alternatives and hedge funds that are lagging behind it all. So there's a little bit of data to say this seems to be a big issue for people. We, Digitaire, and I'll introduce us in a second, we work across banking, investment management, energy and commodities trading. And it's interesting that we're seeing this theme come through and surface across not just all our client areas and sectors, but also all the way through the supply chain. So one of our large energy generators and distributors today was talking to us about the challenge they've got of delivering, if you like, green rather than what they call gray energy and power to their clients, and how they do that so that they can help their industrial clients become basically more aware of their ESG footprint and then help them to green themselves. So it's going all the way through the supply chain, be it investment management, energy commodities trading, banking. Some of the large banks have looked at how they assess if ESG criteria on their loan book, for example. So I think you're here because you know it's a big issue. The data suggests it's a big issue, and we'll talk about then how we address that. James, next slide, please. So let's look at data, because really this comes down to data. That's the heart of it. Software, as you know, is really a way of manipulating and visualizing data. So data to us is not the new oil, it's the new water. And it's the new water because you can't really survive for very long without it, whereas most of us can survive a few days without driving our car. And organizations just can't thrive without not just data, but a high quality of data and an increasing variety of data. So whatever the future holds in the future, it's going to be a lot more data. And that data part is linked to what we describe as digital enabled transformation. So again, I'll use a case study from a conversation I had with an organization today where they're looking at how they streamline their client engagement process. This is in the energy trading space rather than investment management. And they were looking to digitize that. But now the overriding priority is to become, how do we green it? But using digitization and the transformation that can help drive. So workflows, visualization, sort of straight through processing, coupled with the right data and putting power in the hands of their end users to work out for themselves what green looks like for them, what ESG looks like for them, is the sort of zeitgeist we're seeing. So handing tools and processes and data to, where possible, the end users and the decision makers is part of that journey. But a large part of this is around culture. So you can't solve these problems without generating and building the right culture where people understand data and interactively, effectively make decisions around that data, knowing that it's valid, it's appropriate time-wise, and that the tooling supports their ability to understand that data better. So if you do that right, you can reduce friction, improve usability, and free up some talent, human talent, to tackle higher value problems. I think ESG is a very high value problem at the moment, and accelerate the speed of development across the enterprise. So I'd like you to sort of view all the stuff we talk about today in that context.
Can you make sure Ziggs doesn't shake on the laundry, please?
Perhaps I could ask that person to mute themselves if that would be possible. I'm happy to do the laundry later if that's of any use to anyone. On the data transformation challenge, just looking at this for a minute, again, from a sort of high level point, there are barriers everywhere. So you will see if you are involved already or get involved in an ESG type initiative, the bottom left, the barriers are around the organizational silos, the sorts of data that you're trying to pull together to solve ESG reporting and analytics problems are data that often sit in different data sources and repositories, both within your enterprise, but also outside. And when you try and pull that data in, you've got to make sense of it. And often it's of either variable data quality or indeed presence. So one of the factors we'll touch on is, what do you do when you're reporting on ESG factors where there is no data in maybe some portfolios or some companies, they just don't have data on certain attributes, or where the data is just of a very different quality or consistency or nature. So how do you transform that data to make sense of it? And also, do you have the technical capability? Because the nature of ESG is, it is an order of magnitude greater volumes of data when you're building a portfolio and trying to do the analytics on that than you have in a non-ESG world. So do you actually have, in very simple terms, the functional and the non-functional capabilities. So the tools is the functional bit, but non-functional might be, can I handle this volume of data? Can I process it and recalculate fast enough? So we'll touch on that. And the organizational culture, I can't stress this enough, it won't succeed without the organizational culture aligning with that outcome. So the key for us is using data-driven technology transformation to align the cultural factors to achieve what you're looking for throughout your stakeholder pipeline. And if we can do that, you can start to achieve this, if you like, transformation as the new normal. So staying ahead, or at least in line with the competition, managing costs as best you can. So doing it once and using it many times is a basic principle in data management, rather than replicating or copying or duplicating that data and spreading it across the entirety of your organization with all the problems you get from that. And also try and solve both the regulatory problems and, let's call it, the market advantage problems. So today we'll be talking a little about SFDR, which is around the, if you like, the sustainable finance related regulation, but it's also very good business. So we're seeing that for organizations in the investment space where portfolio companies that are, let's call them ESG compliant, are tending to outperform those who aren't by several percentage points. So it's great business, and it's also necessary from a regulatory perspective. But let's try and bring those together and do it once and address both of those needs. The volume and the value of that data needs to be controlled. It needs to be timely and accurate, so we'll touch on. And then finally, as I said, bringing it together, and I touched on culture, but it's an organizational approach. It isn't just a technology approach or the people in the data organization. It's not just a silo. It's trying to run this throughout the whole organization. And I think that's going to be one of the big challenges here for some of the underlying portfolio companies trying to, let's say, green themselves or make themselves more ESG compliant, is to do that across all sectors, all parts of the supply chain, and all divisions. So that means you've got to understand your data. And let's look at the stages of that. Again, a little way of illustrating it. If you go from stage one, where we call it regressive, but really it's where you've got very little data, or the data is of very poor quality, or it's just not being used. So in very simple terms, it's an organization that is very low on that data maturity curve, wouldn't do much with data. It might be individual decision making not supported by data to back it up. And then you start to get to this level 2, where it might be a bit more repeatable. You've got data, and you could use that same data month in, month out, that gets better and better in terms of quality. But you're certainly aware that data is there, and you've got a steady flow. And quite quickly, that becomes a large volume of data, but not necessarily well managed, quite often in silos. It's often divisional or functional. So where you're trying to get to, this make-break point, is the consistency around stage 3, where people are very proficient in their data. They've got standardized data sets, standardized interfaces and reporting, and a fairly consistent corporate taxonomy and metadata. And you've got this cultural shift going on around understanding that we're a business that deals in data first. That's where that sort of mind shift comes, and the data is explainable. But where we're going to have to get people is towards stage 4+. So where the data is quantitatively managed, people are savvy around it. And most of you are, absolutely no doubt, but we've got to get that around the ESG related stuff and start to look at predictive analytics around it, and understanding the link between that and market behavior, and using data which is trusted, a single view of that data, a single view of the truth, trusted and used across all aspects of the business in a consistent way to support all critical business decisions. And I think that journey is where most organizations are, is going from somewhere in 3 to somewhere in stage 4. If you happen to be in stage 5, the obvious ones are the big tech companies such as Google or Apple, who started with data and built out. It's easier for them to do that. And they're applying basically user experience principles to receive feedback and bring feature sets to life within their customer base. So that's just a little bit of a, if you like, an overview of the journey. We find as Digitaire, as a software house and a sort of a technology-driven consulting house, we spend a lot of our time moving people from stage 3 up to stage 4, or stage 4 to stage 5. So I'm going to, James, can you advance the slide one more, please? I'm going to pass you over to Daryl. As I said, Daryl is the head of bitter risk globally, and so understands the problem very well, has overseen the solution to that problem. We work very closely with Daryl, and he knows a lot about the subject. So Daryl, over to you.
Ian, good afternoon to everyone. Ian, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about the project that we did with Digitaire towards the end of last year to build the Beta ESG Manager. ESG Manager is a series of modules that basically allow you to embed ESG data within the portfolio management, reporting, analytics, and monitoring process. I'm going to cover the background to the project first, look at its objectives, and then the results. To start, let me set the scene around the ESG landscape. As we're all aware, and Ian has already covered, ESG, or environmental, social and governance, is probably one of the hottest topics at the moment, whether it's talking about climate change, social change, our environment or investment. Navigating the ESG landscape is complex, with multiple sets of ESG data, the EU taxonomy, sustainable development goals, and client preferences. This breadth requires a clear data strategy, defining what data is going to be used for what purposes and from where it can be sourced. Despite the fact that it's a hot topic, there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of how to define it and how to incorporate ESG in the field of private wealth management. SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, triggered action in the fund and institutional spaces, requiring firms to label their products accurately where they purported to be ESG or sustainable in terms of their ESG credentials, and also report on their content. The private wealth space has lagged behind so far. There have been ESG-driven mutual funds and centrally led thematic buy list and ESG model portfolio initiatives, plus also the extension of traditional product avoidance approaches in ethical screening. Until this week, everybody was waiting for the regulator to release its first consultation paper, and that arrived the day before yesterday. I'm not going to cover that in today's talk, but you can watch this space where we'll be reporting back on that later. Needless to say, we've actually front-run the regulator, and I think we'll be helping firms meet a number of the requirements. Early movers are already active in this space. They're looking at ESG not in terms of the regulation, but looking at it in terms of the interests of their client, the client's demands and best business practice from an investment point of view. So we have a complex, fast-moving, fast-changing landscape in which we were trying to build a new investment application. James. Next slide, James, thanks. So underpinning what a firm needs in terms of embedding ESG within their investment process is a series of policies. And these are things that we had to consider, and we had to consider the breadth of these policies before we started with the project. One of the first questions really to ask is, what is ESG and what does it mean in any given context? Let's look at it from three perspectives. And I'm probably teaching you all something you already know here, but it's good to understand it and get the ground rules set. If we look at risk, utility, and return, risk in terms of the ability of a company to be able to continue to operate in the future when taking various ESG risk factors into consideration, not only environmental, but also social, often referred to as the social license to operate. We have seen many companies shunned by activists because what they have done either in the past or in the present, and this has forced major changes at board level or in company policy. Carbon taxes, product risks, brown property portfolios, and the impact of climate change are just examples of these risks. Secondly, let's consider the investor's utility or happiness. This now goes beyond the concept of utility derived purely from return. There are new factors. The impact of companies on the environment, their labor forces, or their governance. An investor may have a utility in terms of whether they feel good about investing in companies that do well in these various areas. They may feel positive about divesting in those that do badly. What are the reference points from an individual's perspective? And are these absolute sector relative or trending? So you can see the combinations of data and utility lead to the conclusion that in ESG, there is no one size fits all. And third, let's look at return, which is a common goal. seeking stocks that are going to benefit positively from ESG factors, and looking for the correlation between different factors and return. A big green sticker doesn't necessarily lead you to excess return. It's a combination of much more subtle factors that will drive that correlation between ESG and return. So in order to make this work, we need data. And the choice of the data vendor is like choosing research. You need to do due diligence on the methodology and the coverage. Does the firm undertake its own surveys, use a quantitative approach, or aggregate data from other providers, providing an average or consensus score? Typically, there will be a high-level score for the company and then 3 pillars, E, S, and G, followed by factors and sub-factors, so at least 4 tiers of data. The data can extend across different groupings, including ESG, then looking at controversies, product exposure, specific climate change factors, sustainable impact in terms of positives, carbon emissions, the SDGs, and many of these wrapped into the EU taxonomy. So there can be upwards of 2,000 possible data points per company. On top of this, we then need to consider the upstream and downstream activities of that company. What is the impact of their product on downstream? And how well does that company actually vet its inbound suppliers from upstream? Considering funds and collective vehicles, do you look through into the underlying holdings? If so, how far down the tail is considered significant? What is what we call the red line threshold? In other words, the proportion of that fund that is scoring really badly in a number of one or more factors? Or do you take an aggregate set of scores? If so, how is that calculated? And will the averages actually mask poor scoring components within the fund? A pragmatic approach needs to be taken to this in considering how you use that information. No one can consider all of this data, hence the aggregation tiers provided by the vendors, but these can hide important detail. The policy question, which is which data are you going to use from an investment perspective, and at what granularity can the client express preferences? And this leads us on to look at bias and focus. So bias, or a themed approach. Research has shown that many clients want an ESG approach, but are not concerned about the detailed factors. To that end, themed funds, models, portfolios, focusing on, say, companies that have strong headline environmental scores and above average environmental factor scores are appropriate. While these may be presented at a high level to the client, the investment manager should always seek detail in terms of where the ESG weaknesses are in these portfolios. We're going beyond bias into focus. We look at the particular areas where the client has preferences. They may have a need to have or a wish to have preferences expressed at a very detailed level in a couple of niche areas, but a broader overall view. This becomes more and more common, a broad environmental goal with specific board diversity and product risk requirements, for example. While this may be easy to support for major clients and philanthropists where you can dedicate the resources, how can you support that through mass customization? A key aim of this project was to create a framework that could support mass customization. The data strategy was key, ensuring links between ESG preferences, client mandates, investment strategy, and core data, and then being able to use that data in rebalancing and monitoring across the client book. Within the topic of mass customization comes the investment approach taken to applying the client preferences. Screen out or tilt or combine them. In other words, do I bias the portfolio towards preferences or away from them? Or do I remove conflicting assets? We're currently working on these portfolio rebalancing techniques to enable application of individual portfolio preferences across a client universe automatically. So the questions around policies are really defining what you can offer the client in terms of preference expression, portfolio ESG management and reporting. These were the concepts we considered in our project to create an ESG management application for the private wealth sector. And by that, by definition, would need to be flexible both in terms of data management and investment proposition support. So our objectives. Our objective was really simple: to incorporate ESG into daily private client portfolio management on a modular basis so that different components could be applied as required by an organization. These components can be considered in 4 key areas. Firstly, capturing the client preferences. We wanted to capture a private client's ESG preferences and to be able to support multiple approaches. The questionnaire framework was designed to facilitate different preference option sets for different client segments and also different approaches to preference expression. It had to support preferences across ESG tiers and data groups. We created scaled preferences so that conflicts at different levels of score could be identified, as well as binary yes/no to an interest in an area. One interesting schema sets a predefined set of preferences and hurdle levels linked to a thematic option chosen by the client. This rapidly identifies positions outside the standardized but complex set of preferences across individual portfolios. While the preferences can be set by a client, a manager can also use the same framework to set up screens that they want to apply to a portfolio. ESG data had to be incorporated in the analysis and modeling of portfolios. This is the second factor, sorry. This required portfolio level exposure data, holding contribution data, and holding static data to be displayed and reported on. When modeling a portfolio, changes in positions needed to be instantly reflected in the portfolio overall ESG and ranking scores, and impacts on conflicts with client preferences alerted, together with CO2 contributions and the weighted CO2 of the portfolio. Analysis of current and proposed portfolios was required in the context of and relative to the benchmark as well. When we came to reporting, the reports needed to highlight overall scores, changes between current and proposed portfolios, and positions making major positive or negative contributions. In addition, from a reporting perspective, we wanted to look at portfolio factor exposures on a trending basis, so we could illustrate how portfolios had changed through time to the client. Given that we were collecting client preferences and where these have been expressed, we then needed to be able to monitor the proportion of the portfolio that was in conflict with the preferences on a daily basis. To be able to look at this data across the enterprise, to be able to drill down into individual clients and alert and then report on the conflicted portfolios. So to support all of this, we had to combine data. We had to bring together the ESG data, portfolio information, client preferences, risk, investment strategy, the client input, and the overarching suitability requirement of the client mandate, and bring these together in a way that the investment manager could manage client portfolios efficiently in the context of these preferences. In many ways, this project was highly innovative, and we were one of the first new kids on the block. Our approach was to build an interactive prototype, road test that with clients and prospects over a 6-month period before embarking on the project, and then using the prototype as our starting point for UX or user experience development. While others had looked at providing analysis on individual funds or stocks, they had not combined funds or provided tools to build portfolios within a risk-return framework in conjunction with suitability and private and client preferences in the private client world. Our ability to scale risk and portfolio analytics across hundreds of thousands of portfolios was key to this approach and handling the vast quantities of data that it involved. I've already discussed the complexities of that data and how it is driven by the ESG policy of a firm. A clear understanding of possible data strategies was needed to support the design and the complexity of the system, and enable the application to evolve with changing data and changing investment propositions through time. Understanding how data will be used and distinguishing between core data and client preference specific data was key in building the UX. We had a series of challenges around the data management. We needed to be able to normalize scoring across different metrics to a common scale. We needed to be able to combine scoring series across products in a way that made sense to the user and didn't lose the integrity of that data. We were selecting a small subset of a mass universe of ESG factors. And while we were doing that, we still need to preserve flexibility. So it was very easy to draw more data in or change data as required. And what we found core was how we classified data into display hierarchies, given we were using different sets of data in different places for different purposes. The data model had to be able to evolve rapidly as new data factors were emerging even during the project. And these are required to be easily changeable by firms and are required to support client demands and also new proposition requirements. So agility was key in this project in order to complement the innovation. We gained understanding as we went through the project in terms of the data and how that would then start to interact in real life with portfolios and client preferences. James, thanks, results. So what did we achieve from the output from this project? In terms of data management, we managed to ingest 3 different data sources, combine these in a flexible framework, and homogenize them back to a core scoring scale. In the initial configuration, we used 22 core factors at the display level, with the option to call and display over 200 factors at the preference level. In terms of client preference capture, in our internal version of the system, we support 5 different ESG questionnaires, and a client is directed to the appropriate questionnaire depending on their product proposition. Each of these questionnaires can have anything between 1 and 5 data groups, the ESG, controversies, sustainable impact, etc., with the most complex allowing a client to express preferences on over 300 different attributes. I should say this one is best used when you're doing institutional screening on portfolios rather than private client preferences. We've integrated the client preferences, portfolio overall scores, and the individual asset attributes into our portfolio modeling screen. And this returns full risk, ESG, and suitability analytics on a portfolio. To give some idea of the capacity, we've tested the Portfolio Analytics API that powers this page, and we can now reach over 2,500 portfolios a minute based on 100 stock portfolios. In other words, quite large individual stock portfolios. And that's providing full ESG analytics, risk analytics, and checking our monitoring and pre-trade guidelines. Our client reporting has been hailed as a game changer. We've created screen-based rather than paper reports. They can obviously be printed, but being screen-based makes them interactive and allows us to use really powerful visualization techniques to cover a huge density of data within a page. In this way, we can communicate the portfolio characteristics at a high level, but also provide detail without having to just rely on summarized averages. We're also now looking and discussing the use of these interactive reports through client portals to actually allow clients to assess and analyze the portfolios themselves. Monitoring of the client preferences is key to anybody looking to implement mass customization or to allow freedom within a framework for investment managers. So we've created, as part of our overnight and pre-trade monitoring solution, a set of ESG and product preference monitoring alerts. These are triggered if a portfolio falls outside tolerance ranges in terms of its conflicted exposure. For portfolio exposures, we've created a history that builds up through time, showing the manager and client the trend of a portfolio's ESG factor exposures. So by having a flexible data structure, a flexible client preference framework, and using dynamic reports and integration of ESG data into our portfolio modeling and monitoring, we've created a future-proofed application that will allow a firm to evolve data through time, its client proposition through time, and vary the granularity of the data across different business streams as well. So to summarize, not 4 weddings and a funeral, but 3 quotes and an award. A game changer in client communication. This was from the head of private clients at a large firm, who said it gives the client manager a new investment narrative with which to engage the client. A savior from a firm who was struggling to work out how to combine ESG data in client reporting, and then also to be able to automate the setup of their ESG restrictions. Tomorrow, today, this person recognized that the solution enables people to take their first steps in ESG management in private wealth, but also sets up the foundation as their proposition and data develop. And lastly, last year we won the European Wealth Briefing Award for the most innovative client solution for the ESG manager. So we had a very positive project with Digitaire, building the data management layers and taking our prototypes to then develop the UI. We now have a series of excited investment managers starting to use the product with real clients and real data to assess their portfolios and engage with them on the topics of ESG. And having seen the latest documentation from the FCA, we will certainly be helping firms comply with that going forward. So Ian, I think that's my summary of our project last year, from strategy through execution to delivery. Thank you very much, everyone.
Daryl, thank you very much indeed. A brilliant exposition of kind of the problems and the solutions and how we work together. So thank you very much. And we'll come back, if we may, to some Q&A that are coming through the chat. Just before we do that, I'm just going to pass over to Stephen Ford, who is the delivery manager on the Digitaire side of the team, to talk about just some of the high-level technical challenges. And obviously technical means data in many places. So Stephen, if you could just give us a brief overview of those little chewy technical challenges you took on with the team.
Certainly, very happy to. Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Daryl. It was a really interesting project to work with the teams, both on Digitaire and Core Financial side. So first up was obviously data transform, load and store. And around that, Daryl's already touched on it a couple of slides ago, in terms of getting those raw scores from an ESG provider and really providing some normalization. I think you used the word homogenization. So we normalize those from those raw scores into common bands. And we wanted to do it in a configurable way, not only for various clients, but also for Core Financial. So that was a really important part of the design. And within that, because of the quite large number of additional attributes, the UI would need to pull through and actually calculate based on. And remember, this is actually a modeling tool as well, so that's all going on. And later bullet point talks to that. There was need for a caching strategy, so really to provide quick responses to those users as they interacted with that data and really saw how they could work with it. The second point around the client preference capture. So this is the questionnaire that Daryl mentioned before. So not only extending it, but also having those variable optionalities within the questionnaire and that workflow so that it could be set up for a given client fairly straightforwardly. So it hides a lot of the complications behind the scenes. There's often a quote, isn't there? I think it was Einstein, if you can't explain something in a simple manner, then you don't properly understand it. And I think getting to grasp with that sort of the original raw data all the way through to the modeled data was the key here. Then third here is the actual ESG modeling. So this is the integration within the UI and through some of those quite innovative visuals in effectively blending or integrating those client preferences with the ESG scores across the assets within the portfolio. So that would then give them their feedback as to, am I contravening a certain preference for an environmental, social, governance aspect within my portfolios. And finally, again, Daryl touched upon it, actually, the original target we had was 2,000 portfolios within 60 seconds. Great to hear we can do 2,500. and that shows also the kind of growth within not only the clients but also the data sets themselves. So I think across all of those, you know, it was a really fascinating area to work with, and I think every member of the team enjoyed the delivery, certainly. So thank you very much, Ian. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. A little bit of a kind of, I suppose, a rapid tour of some of the technical challenges, but they were many and varied, I think is probably fair to say. So I've now got a few questions come through the chat, which I'm going to try and bounce off one or both of you. And the first is this one: can the solution handle fund analysis and reporting as well as private client portfolios? That's probably a product question best directed to Daryl, if I may.
Thanks, Ian. In short, yes. The way we've set it up gives us significant flexibility around the data that we can use, the quantity of factors that we can analyze against, and the way that that is then reported back out. As I said at the beginning, we can provide very complex sets of constraints, let's say, rather than necessarily screening on portfolios to identify issues. So from that side, we cover carbon in many different ways for reporting, as well as the sort of factor exposures, identifying the drill down to sort of detailed data on those exposures as well. So yes.
Brilliant. Okay. Are there any sort of obvious limitations on that people should know about?
As ever, the data and the quality of the data. We address the fact that you have missing data in very many cases, and we make that very clear to the user when as part of the system, so they can identify where they're making assessments or analysis based on only part of the portfolio, because only part of the portfolio scores on a particular topic. So I'd say the data is probably the challenge for a lot of people, especially where they've got off-market instruments.
Brilliant. There's another question come through on data, and I'll come back to that in a minute if time allows. So thank you very much for that, Daryl. The next question was, what worked well in terms of delivery approach? So that's probably best answered by Stephen.
Yeah, okay. So as Daryl mentioned, we digitariate themselves agility at greater velocity. So the reason we believe in agility is because not only do we discover and pivot as we learn more about a problem domain, but it also gives, in this way, our sort of partner and client in Core Financial the ability to see real results very quickly. So within only a few weeks of the beginning of the project, we could play back to Daryl our understanding, provide him some examples, real examples, working code, that kind of thing. And I think that ability in close collaboration was essential. As we grew in our understanding, obviously Daryl was already a kind of product expert there, so could very quickly work with us. And I think what also worked well is that prototyping of the UI elements that Daryl had mentioned at the beginning of his introduction. That enabled us to sort of very quickly see what the end goal. So we could actually fit our delivery approach and our development sort of techniques, if you like, to that end goal. What else? Well, I think ultimately, within again agility, that very, very close communication, so that we didn't sort of just disappear for a few weeks and then come back and realize we're on the wrong track. We were day to day feeding back, running. Obviously, we run stand-ups every morning, and we would have deep dive sessions. All of those kind of probably quite normal thing we call three amigos, where you get together with something like a product owner, business analyst, and maybe a developer, and really get into a specific problem area and solve your problems on the way. So each of those sort of approaches really, I think, were turnkey in success of this project.
That's really cool. Thank you very much, Stephen. I'll come back to a bit of that in a minute with another question I think is relevant to it. This one I think is probably more a Daryl question, which is, what have been the key tangible successes of the bitter risk system? I know you covered some of that on the last slide, Daryl, but it'd be good if you could elucidate further.
Yeah, I think the project was delivered more or less on time, which is always a major success.
Always a bonus. Yeah, thank you. Checks in the post on that, Daryl.
And But no, seriously, I think what we found is when we started to take this out to users, we'd obviously done our road testing with the prototype, but we got very positive reactions. And in our first rollout, when we made a press release, we actually found that the investment managers were sharing this press release out across LinkedIn with their clients and their intermediary introducers. So there was an excitement around the product. It seems to have been very well received by the users as well. So I don't think you can actually ask for more than that. A project that's delivered on time and something that people actually like when you roll it out to the front office.
It certainly helps. That's an added bonus, definitely, when people like it. So, but I mean, it is a genuine big win when you've got users actually wanting this thing rather than it being pushed upon them. So that's very positive.
And I think because we'd listened during the design phase, we did workshops with a number of our clients. We actually understood as much as they were able to articulate at that time, because this is, a couple of years ago now that we started this process. We listened to what they needed and wanted, and we delivered back against that in terms of quick, easy analysis, being able to see the impact of any changes on a portfolio as you go through that process of modeling it, and how you get a before and after picture of the portfolio exposures.
Great. And there's another question here which picks up on something you touched on earlier on, I think, Daryl. It said, how did you overcome challenges around limited data availability as the project developed? So it's probably a bit of Stephen and a bit of you, Daryl, but it was one you touched on earlier. So maybe Stephen kick off and then Daryl pick up from there.
Yeah, you're right, Daryl. You mentioned that in terms of obviously some of those off-market assets weren't there, and in the eventual tool, it was important to make sure the users didn't or weren't misled in terms of having an answer that was saying you're all green. Well, actually, some of it was grey, some of it was unknown. I think that was the key point to that missing data. Because and also those data sets are evolving over time. So I think that's another reason why this had to be quite a flexible, configurable, and so on solution, because not only are the way that the ESG kind of, if you like, data points calculated evolving, but also the number of those data points, so the areas in which people are being rated and scored. So that had to, obviously cover that. And then, of course, assets themselves are forever being, added to the market across the world. So I think that combination of being very clear on whether somebody was being given, a complete green where all of their assets were completely fine, or actually only a partial result, was quite important in feedback in the UI elements.
So it sounds like, as much as anything, you're actually building a system that has to handle change.
Absolutely.
So the data sources are changing. Yeah, a lot of it.
And in fact, Daryl, I remember during the initial brief, obviously we started with one provider. I don't know whether you want to mention it, but aware that you were very likely to need to integrate many more from that point. So, and even the providers differ in terms of some may be sort of on an ABC scale, another on a numeric scale, and so on. So it was combining those. And again, that goes to my point on the previous slide, actually, around data sort of normalization, but also mapping for those categories.
And by provider, you mean data provider there, Stephen, is that correct?
ESG data provider, yeah,
Okay.
the scores. So, yeah.
Daryl, anything to add to that point about effectively overcoming those challenges?
It's a massive challenge, because when you have to explain in a user interface that you're calculating an average based on the information that scores, as opposed to the stuff that doesn't score, that's a lot of verbiage to put on the screen. So we found ways of visualizing this so that people could actually see what portion of the portfolio actually held data against any given factor. And also using our ESG barcode, identifying where a stock was missing data points as well. So it's all about giving the manager the information they need to make decisions at the end of the day, and making the best of the data that they've got.
That actually interesting may feed onto this next question. It says, how does the system deal with management reporting? You might want to answer that either specifically or generally, but it sounds like part of that is what you just covered.
Yeah, I think there's probably a series of different management reports that one wants to look at. The obvious ones are where I talk about monitoring and looking at the portion of portfolios that are outside tolerances in terms of conflicted holdings. That's one step. The other is if you're putting a tool like this in the front office, what is the take-up? Who is using it? What elements are they using? And as a core part of our application, we have audit trails as to what people are doing. And so we can gain that data in terms of what is the sort of successful functionality that people use the most, and where are the sort of blockages in the process. So in terms of the third thing is looking at MI around clients and preferences. So what portion of your client base is actually expressing preferences through the questionnaire? And how detailed are those preferences? And that's something we're working on now to start to build out sort of preference heat maps, so you can actually see what the clients actually care about at the end of the day. If you're going to put 20, 30 factors in front of them, is it always the same 3 that people actually are looking at?
I'm assuming the answer is no. Is that the case?
Too early to say.
Okay, interesting. But you say you are getting effectively user stats on the system, so that's helping you iterate and develop it further.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Another one here, probably for Stephen, on what are the 2 or 3 top technical challenges on the project? I know you covered some of those, but on your slide, Stephen, but it'd be very interesting to articulate those further if you can.
So yeah, I think so. In addition to those, or maybe developing those 4 areas, well, I would say probably the mapping of data. So again, we've talked about this a little bit before, but yeah, data design and transformation. And obviously, if anybody's kind of aware of coding in the background, treating a number is different to treating a character and so on. So to get sort of efficiencies, there were some sort of techniques needed. We use caching as well as to ensure performance was supported. And again, this is quite a rich front end that the tool provides users, so it has to perform very well. But yeah, mapping those data categories, and ultimately it was the complexity of all of that transformation. So if you get a score in from a given provider, how do you make sure that by the time it's not only you've got the raw score, you've got the normalized category, you've then got the client preference, and then an outcome. So is it within my happy band or sad band? Am I happy or not? Do I not like that particular score? And how does that compare? And I think getting that not only developed, but then proving it through testing as well. So I think the quality assurance framework that we built, so it was, we in fact wrote a lot of automated tests, because it's one of those solutions where if you change one aspect over here, you have to make sure you haven't regressed elsewhere. So I think the testing actually of this tool was paramount to its success. So I'd had that in as an extra technical challenge. We talked about missing data, and again, that would be then tested. So we had to provide good example test data, not only for the happy path, but also for those edge cases in some cases. Yeah.
Okay. So that's part of your delivery, I guess, approach and methodology, is that automated test stuff up front. Okay.
And the QA, person responsible was very much part of the development team. So this isn't somebody that waits for 3 months and then says, right, I'm ready to test. This is every day checking with the requirements from the very beginning and making sure that those acceptance criteria against each of the user stories is understood, is ready to be tested at the end of a sprint. And some aspects weren't ready immediately in the first sprint, so it might have rolled over to another sprint. They then had to ensure that those acceptance criteria passed. We then also had Daryl and various other people testing as well to make sure that it was as they would expect.
Brilliant. So that sounds like that the QA framework, the automated test framework, was a key part of the success of the program in terms of making sure you could develop fast enough.
Definitely, and I think it's key in any highly numeric or any highly quantitative effort and software delivery. Without that test framework, you can get wrong very quickly and not know it. So I think that's really key.
Brilliant. And I think we've got time for just one more question, which is this one. Was scalability a significant issue for you?
I mean, I think from a technical point of view, scalability was a concern, because in the background, as Daryl mentioned, 200 odd preferences in the background, 22 displayed on the screen. So I think scalability in two ways. There was a visual scalability, because there's a very neat little barcode, and obviously that has to be managed within screen real estate. So we only had so much real estate to fit everything in. But also having all of those preferences definitely challenged the initial kind of delivery. So that's when we looked into performance tuning, and not only so right from the queries, the data structures used, and in the manner in which we cached, which I also talked about before, so not to repeat myself too much, but yeah, that caching strategy was put in place for that exact reason. But that is a kind of natural way of developing a performance approach, because until you have working software, you don't really know where to tune. And again, tuning effort can be a kind of 80-20 rule, where you can carry on tuning, but the returns diminish at the very tail of it. So this was quite a pragmatic approach to performance tuning, I guess. So scalability, absolutely, to answer the question. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephen. I've got 2 minutes left to do some key takeaways and a wrap up. So James, if you could just hop over to that slide, I'd be grateful. And I guess the key takeaways from our mutual experience between us have been, if you took it from an overall data strategy and data architecture perspective, rather than simply it's an ESG problem, and see that there were some vital steps to create that effective data strategy and arguably a single view of the truth. So all the stuff you've talked about between you have really been about creating a single view of the truth on that data, which you can slice and dice in different ways and get a consistent set of outputs. So the key steps to that is to take stock of the data assets you have, inventory and mapping it. Stephen, you talked about in the beginning. Planning for legacy data sources, and obviously allow for silos and how we bring those together, and focus on creating an effective data backbone, either literal in the technical sense or metaphorical more in the business sense, and prepare for a scale of volume of data and number of data sources that might be relatively new to the organization. I think we're getting that theme coming out from both of you. Second thing is, if you remember that data maturity curve I touched on, is you really are going to have to push up that data maturity curve. So all decision making is going to have to be supported by data, and coming back to single view of the truth, it's got to be consistently so. There's no point in reporting in one format and one way on month one, and then month two, with broadly the same data sources, having different outcomes. And that wouldn't be a consistent way to report across the data. So making sure the data is consistent enough and understood enough that people can use that to run the business and support all data decision making. And the third is, competitive pressures and changes in the workplaces are there. So it's going to require more data, better control and confidence, but let's tie those into the regulatory requirements, because we've got to do that too. Otherwise, you're addressing two related problems in two separate ways. So do make sure your strategy around ESG is broadly part of an overall data strategy to encompass regulatory requirements and competitive requirements, and finally with that customer requirements. So drive out the cost and efficiency benefits you can get to get the ROI you want and the business improvements you want. I think the final 2 points really is around an agile approach to this. They're not just agile in the capital A as we have here. Could argue that's a particular software development methodology, but with a small a, so business agile, and certainly software development iteratively, which is really what agile means. So Stephen, you talked about that action to inform. So use that mining at the coalface to better understand the problem and surface those issues, identify what's the most pressing next thing to solve, deliver that, get stakeholder feedback, and iteratively mine your way through the problem, but driven by stakeholder feedback. So inspect and adapt is how we might say in the software world. And moving to cloud, if you haven't done so already, is a great enabler to help that happen, because you get around some of the technical constraints of old style architectures and infrastructure. And the last one, coming back to this data point, is really an enterprise wants to be and should be developing a very flexible, scalable data architecture. Call it data backbone, data meshes, doesn't matter what your architecture is, but make sure that you have the ability to ingest data, validate data, surface data, and use that to create a single view of the truth for multiple different purposes. So I think that's it from my side. Last slide, James, is thank you all very much for attending. Really appreciate you coming. If you have any other questions, do feel free to email myself or Daryl at any point. But I'll give you all of 30 seconds to enjoy coffee before your next session. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.